Hello. Thank you all for being with us today, again online, for the 11th edition of the Experimental Curators Hub. We remain bound by thought and action, even though we are apart from each other. The 11th edition of the Experimental Curators Hub is poised to venture forward as curators and co-thinkers will posit propositional ideas that reevaluate how we can not only think of exhibition making, but how can we shape the world around us by the work we do. As many of you would know, dialogue is central to our way of thought at Experimenter and has given us strength in knowing that possibilities emerge from conversation. Our conversations oscillate between many polarities. How can we be equivocal about issues that confront us, underscore the differences that are inherent in it, and yet build a constructive, sustainable dialogue? While we continue to hold other core values close to us, how can we also think about care, responsibility, respect, and cohabitation? The hub is structured differently this year, and Priyanka will come to it in a bit. I wanted to say that the last day of the hub this year also includes a closing address by Rana Ayu, whose voice and position we deeply admire, and much like curators and artists, think about her role to mirror the society that we live in, to ask difficult questions and to seek truth at all costs. Similar challenges confront us all across geographies and contexts. We hope to speak together and with each other over the next few days about tangible ideas, even realizing possibilities that may emerge out of these conversations, but also hope that we can speak about what is intangible, the phantoms that haunt us and the spirits that protect us. I will now ask Priyanka to join me in welcoming all our speakers and collaborators and audiences today. Priyanka.
Thank you, Prateek, and welcome to each one of you. We're very mindful of the fatigue and challenges of this online space, and in spite of it all, so grateful that so many of you have joined us here in the Zoom room and on all our platforms. Thank you, Art Review, for extending your platform to us to extend what we lose with the fact that we have to be online another year. I hope this is the last of our online sessions of the Experimental Curators Hub. I wanted to share a little bit more deeply the structural changes we have in the hub this year. This year, we've invited 5 curators whose work we deeply admire, and in turn asked them to invite individuals who may be beyond the scaffoldings of what constitutes curatorial authority, but are deep influences on their thinking and their work. We were keen to merge the boundaries of what constructs the hub and imagine this year to be inclusive of a multitude of voices. We wanted not only to look back at exhibitions, to deliberate curatorial thinking and challenges, but to look ahead in a way. We requested for the invited curators and their collaborating speakers to present propositional ideas or projects that could take shape in due course and be via a collaborative process. They could be about exhibition making, but also could be about infrastructural building. Our invited curators have generously responded to our prompt, and what we will witness over the following days is a set of propositions that may be starting points for not just them in partnership with each other, but also each one of us who are listening in to maybe reapply or appropriate to our own context. With this, I welcome each one of you and our speakers from the various corners of the world. Elvira Diangani-Ose, the director of MAGPA Barcelona, who brings with her her past colleague and close collaborator, curator of the Showroom London, Lily Hall. Mikala Tai, curator and head of the visual arts at Australia Council for the Arts, who will present alongside creative entrepreneur and co-founder of ArtSpay, Mark Goldenfine. Jose Bonsu, curator of international art at Tate Modern, who will speak along with the wonderful artist Ndiritu. Ratnamol Johal, art historian and curator, who has invited Emily Jasser and Eileen Curie of the Darjasser Foundation, Bethlehem, for the fantastic work that Emily, Eileen, along with their colleagues are doing at the foundation in Bethlehem. And today we will hear Stephanie Rosenthal, curator and director of Gropius Bao, who will present along with the fascinating practice of Grace Ndiritu. Welcome also to our closing speaker, our inspiration, the fearless and crucial voice, Rana Ayub. Our deepest gratitude to our dear friend and co-thinker, Natasha Janwala, for moderating and really holding the pulse of the Curators Hub once again. Natasha brings to the Hub a very deep, sensitive, nuanced understanding and a voice that is most reflective of our collective position at Experimenter. Thank you, Natasha. Without you, the Hub would never be the same. I would also like to thank our partners for their continued and undying support and belief in us and the work we do. Australia Council for the Arts, Australian High Commission, Kolkata, Goethe Institute, Kolkata, Art Review Magazine, and Take Magazine. Thank you for each one of you for supporting the work that we've been doing all these years. And most importantly, to our pillars at Team Experimenter, Joshua, Uma, Vidhi, Aman, Aditya, Anjishnu, Mohor, Shivani, and our extended teams. Thank you. Without you, we're nothing. With this, I will invite my colleague Joshua to run us through a few house rules. I know several of you have attended the Hub last year online, but it acts as a ready reminder of certain things that are important for us to keep in mind. Joshua.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Experimenter Curators Hub 2021 in our online format. We look forward to spending the week of the Hub with you, immersed in discussion and dialogue. At this point, I'm reaching out with a few guidelines for the upcoming days of the Hub. Over each day of the Hub, we will be hearing from each curator and their invited collaborator. We will also have a moderated panel discussion on Sunday, the 14th of November. Each curator and collaborator presentation is for about 1 hour and 45 minutes in dialogue, including a Q&A session. We encourage you to be as communicative as possible. Please also share your questions in the Q&A box during the webinar. It's below your screen. We encourage you to be as communicative as possible. We also request you not to screenshot during the sessions. Presentations are recorded and freely available on our YouTube channel and website following the sessions. We would appreciate if you could join each session up until the 14th. We also envision the Hub to be an open and safe space for discourse. We request attendees to please be mutually respectful to one another during the course of the Hub. We look forward to coming together over the next days, and I am now handing over to my colleague Vidhi, who will introduce our moderator, Natasha Janwala.
Hello, it's my pleasure to introduce Natasha Janwala, although she needs no introduction. Natasha is our co-thinker, long-term collaborator, and moderator for the 11th edition of Experimenter Curators Hub. She is a curator, writer, and editor based in Colombo and Berlin. Janwala is an associate curator at Gropius Bao, Berlin, artistic director of Colombo Scope in Sri Lanka, and the 13th Guangzhou Biennial with Daphne Ayers. Janwala has curated Contour Biennale and Polyphonic Words, Justice as Medium, and was part of the curatorial team of Documenta 14-2017. Since joining Gropius Bao in 2018, she has curated a number of exhibitions, including survey shows of Bani Abidi, Akin Bode Akin B. Other recent projects include Shadow Circus at Savvy Contemporary with Bonaventure and Dikung, Arrival Incision, Indian Modernism as Peripatetic Itinerary in the framework of Hello World, Revising a Collection, at Hamburger Bahnhof Museum für Gegenwart, Berlin in 2018. Riots, slow cancellation of the future at IFA Gallery, Berlin and Stuttgart in 2018. My East is Your West at the 56th Venice Biennial in 2015. And Corruption Everybody Knows with Eflux, New York in 2015. Jinbala was a member of the artistic team for the 8th Berlin Biennial for Contemporary Art in 2014 and co-curated the Museum of Rhythm at Taipei Biennial in 2012 and at Museum Stucky Lodz in 2016 and 2017. Jinbala writes regularly on contemporary art and visual culture. Recent co-edited volumes include Stronger Than Bone, published by Archive Books and Guangzhou Biennial Foundation, as well as Knights of the Dispossessed, Riots Unbound, published by Columbia University Press. Natasha, it's a pleasure to have you back, and over to you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome also from my side to be part of the Hub in 2021 virtually for the second time, especially to artists who are with us and also those who have been part of the Curators Hub in earlier editions. It's quite rare, I believe, for such a format to be continuing in such a robust way after so many years. I know for sure it's definitely the longest engagement I've borne the responsibility to tread this very, very special gathering together for around 7 years now. So on the closing day of the Experimental Curators Hub last year, with cultural workers who have been part of different editions since it began a decade ago, we unpacked the role of the curator once more for these unbracketed times. In various ways, we thought a non-essential worker in this pandemic context, in this pandemic vortex, a visual author, a custodian, a raconteur, a cultural whistleblower, one philosophically chasing luminous moments while also being WhatsApp junkies, and eventually curating as composing an interpretive scenography of friendship. Whichever way we may go about our role, it is clear we are never making alone. And it is this embrace of conviviality, which does exist amidst the mean and lean upward spiral of individuation, as the vital atmosphere of practice that we wish to cite from and dwell within through these days. Our tendency during the Hub has been to recall those thinkers and makers who have shone their light across socio-cultural hemispheres and passed on. Today, I invoke Lauren Berlant, who passed on this year and wrote incredible texts such as Cruel Optimism, encouraging us as affective subjects to continually calibrate our belonging to the world and to strangers, to dream with eyes wide open while surrendering to vulnerability. When addressing us as desiring beings, she coached, "There is nothing more alienating than having one's pleasures disputed by someone with a theory." I'd like to remember that. This year, as Priyanka has already shared, we've invited curators with their peers. These are allies, collaborators, interlocutors. I can't help but rhyme, conspire and respire in my head, to share propositions, values, and modalities, asking each of you what will remain, what counts as a remainder. How may our labor be part of a circulatory grammar such that its residues remain functional rather than adding to the glut in an exhausted planet? In her book, X-Ray Architecture, Beatrice Colomina reminds us, modernity was driven by illness. The engine of modern architecture was not a heroic, shiny, functional machine working its way across the globe, but a languid, fragile body suspended outside daily life in a protective cocoon of new technologies and geometries. It is the difficulty of each breath, and therefore the treasure of each breath, the melancholy of modernity. We have witnessed the onerous unevenness of the ongoing pandemic as it swells, steadies, and pierces through our defenses. We are pressed to remain creative beings while our epidermal ties cause paranoia. How to localize effectively without becoming regimented by border zones that hem us in. How to organize publicly while there is an increasing atomization of social bonds. During and soon after the second wave of the pandemic in India, and I state this because this is also where we are located or suspended from, we saw headlines such as this in the month of July. And I'm just seeking to highlight here the terrible incongruity between truth and falsehood, how to survive amidst those sustaining tyranny and find ways to stand by those fighting and suffocating for our collective freedoms. In April, the world saw gut-wrenching pictures coming from India of overflowing makeshift pyres burning in Delhi, but also many other parts of the country, where COVID-19 victims were laid to rest. Some of these were shot by Reuters journalist Danik Siddiqui, among others. Sky Arundhati Thomas notes, Siddiqui shot the Kathmandu earthquake in 2015, but also visited Rohingya refugee camps. Through a whirlwind of catastrophe, Siddiqui placed himself right in the storm's eye. He was not alone, but he was rare. He was executed by the Taliban in southern Kandahar, Afghanistan this July. While members of the Taliban forced women out of banking jobs in Kandahar, escorted out by gunmen and told their jobs would be given to male relatives. In India, we saw the headline that you see here, but then also there was another death reported in custody of the Indian state as 84-year-old Jesuit priest, human rights defender, and tribal rights activist Stan Swami passed on, suffering from Parkinson's and also battling COVID till the end. He is, as many of you would know, one of the BK16, incarcerated lawyers, teachers, trade unionists, Dalit intellectuals, and activists who have been held captive by the Indian state since 2018. Apologies for this shorthand pattern recognition, but this subhuman cruelty is what floated into my head at midnight as I was penning this statement. This much is clear. Looking away is an impossibility. As cultural organizers, we simply must not. Here I'm sharing Francisco Goya's One Can't Look from the series The Disasters of War, 1810 to 15, that have been described as a prodigious flowering of rage for its time. It may be full of contradictions now, but here we are today, faced with another image, this one posted by Afghan journalist Lutfullah Najafizada that went viral after the Taliban resurged and grabbed power, showing a man whitewashing or wiping out the painted pictures of women outside a beauty salon in Kabul. We witness multiple cover-ups of injustice through the course of each day at a dizzying pace. How may we develop ways of reading these scenarios as planetary cataclysms that affect us all? Let us fleetingly take refuge in the words of Ellen Bass. The thing is to love life, to love it even when you have no stomach for it. And everything you've held dear crumbles like burnt paper in your hands. Your throat filled with the silt of it. When grief sits with you, its tropical heat thickening the air, heavy as water, more fit for gills than lungs. When grief weighs you down like your own flesh, only more of it, an obesity of grief, you think, how can a body withstand this? Then you hold life like a face between your palms, a plain face, no charming smile, no violet eyes, and you say, yes, I will take you. I will love you again. As we commence the Curators Hub this year, I'm moved to acknowledge the disorder of things, Quoting from Jack Halberstam's Wild Things, the Disorder of Desire, dark and deep places of the wild that move away from the episteme of an order of things, elaborated on through colonial travel, possession, and annihilation, rather than evaded through ruination. To recognize untamed ecologies as the other side of classification and refute the violence of total legibility. Let us enliven an aesthetics of bewilderment, as Halberstam puts it, becoming lost in space and time in order for unknowing, unthinking, and unbecoming to take hold, as we are living in the ruins of other worlds and their visions for the future. Thank you for listening. I'm going to now introduce our guests for today. And it is a big pleasure to welcome Stephanie Rosenthal and Grace Ndiritu. Stephanie Rosenthal has been director of the Gropiusbau in Berlin since 2018. And I can say it is a big honor to work with her and for her. She began her program that year with the exhibition Lee Bull, Crash, which was organized in collaboration with the Hayward Gallery London. Her subsequent exhibitions have included Garden of Earthly Delights, Wutsang, There Is No Violent Way to Look at Somebody, who was also a resident artist, Li Mingwei, Gifts and Rituals, Otobong Nkanga, There Is No Such Thing as Solid Ground, another artist who was based with us at Gropiusbau, and most recently, Yayoi Kusama, a retrospective, A Bouquet of Love, I Saw in the Universe. She will also speak to us today about the exhibition Zhengwo, Wanwu Council. From 2007 to 17, Stephanie was a chief curator at Hayward Gallery in London, where she curated numerous exhibitions with celebrated international artists that have included Dayanita Singh, Robin Rode, and Anna Mendieta, but also group exhibitions, some of which we will hear about today, such as Move, Choreographing You. And earlier to this, she has worked as curator at Haus der Kunst in Munich and staged acclaimed exhibitions there. Stephanie was artistic director of the 20th Biennale in Sydney in 2016 that was titled The Future is Already Here, It's Just Not Evenly Distributed. A lot to think about from that specific edition too. Grace and Ndiritu, it's been a pleasure to meet in person recently at the Gropiusbau as she was part of our latest program series, AMA, 4 Days of Caring, Repairing and Healing. Grace is a British Kenyan artist whose artworks bring together various mediums from textile to film and center around community building. She invests in building approaches of social practice that address mental health, reparations, spiritual traditions, and intersectional justice. Some of Ndiritu's projects include the ARC, Center for Interdisciplinary Experimentation, Cover Slut, Fashion and Economic Project, and the performance art series Healing the Museum, which have been shown internationally since 2012. Some of her writing is also available on the Gropiusbau Journal. Recently, her debut short, Black Beauty, has been selected for film festivals such as the 71st Berlinale in Forum Expanded and FID Marseille. Grace's writings also include a critical theory book, Descent Without Modification, and her writing appears in other journal anthologies too. Welcome to both of you. The session is in your hands.
Hello. First of all, I'd like to thank everybody for being here today. I'd like to thank Experimenter for inviting me, and of course, Stephanie for inviting me to have this conversation with her. I think it'd be kind of nice to begin the session with following on from that beautiful Ellen Bass poem with something I'm calling the Museum of the Future. It's a guided meditation. And so I'll just begin. So I'd like you to begin to feel relaxed and sit in a comfortable position. To contextualize the meditation, I will just read this quote. On any given day that you visit the ancient Egyptian galleries at the British Museum in London, you may not realise that the objects on display are unhappy. They no longer feel special because of the cultural and energetic rape that has been enacted on them through being exposed to the endless photography of tourists and feel objectified in the true sense of the word. These objects were never meant to be seen by a single ray of sunlight, never mind millions of keen museum goers. Hence, they feel they've been robbed of their agency and such have no rights. They want to be free. How have I come to this conclusion? By accessing different states of mind and consciousness over the last few years. This quote is taken from my essay, Ways of Seeing, a new museum story for planet Earth, which has recently been republished by Gropius Bauer Journal. So today's performance is also inspired by my own research and also by ecological activist Joanna Macy, her work from the 1960s, and the London activist group BP or Not BP, whose work connects environmental justice to museum ethnographic collections and corporate sponsorship by oil companies. Their famous slogan, stolen land, stolen culture, stolen climate. So to begin the meditation, I'd like everybody to sit in a relaxed, comfortable position and to close their eyes. And as you close your eyes, I'd like you to focus on the area just below the nostril and above the upper lip. And I'd like you to keep closing your eyes, and as you focus on the area just below the nostril and above the upper lip, you notice the breath going in and going out. And as you notice the breath going in and going out, you notice that sometimes it is long and sometimes it is short. Well, if the breath is long, let it be long. And if the breath is short, let it be short. Let it be naturally what it is. Do not change the breath. Let it be natural. And sit like this for a few moments as we reconnect with ourselves and come into our bodies. Now, keeping the focus on the area just below the nostrils and above the upper lip, I want you to think of a moment about your youngest living descendant. It may be your child or your nephew or your niece or someone not directly in your lineage, but a child that feels like the future to you. Imagine the life of this person, their past and their present. Imagine them growing into an adult and having a child of their own. Now picture this new child coming into a world a few generations into the future. And stay connected to our breath. We allow this child to grow up and become an adult. We allow this child, who's now grown up, to have its own baby. So notice the eye colour of this new baby, this child's child. The colour of its hair, the way its chin is, the way it moves. And we allow this descendant to grow up in time, and it becomes ready to have its own child. And this new child, we begin to wonder, what kind of future can we hope for this child and for this child's child? You see this child taking its first steps. We see its hair colour, the shape of its body, its complexion. And we notice the world that this baby enters into. The network of family and friends, the community it will live in. And again, we ask ourselves, what kind of future can we expect for this child? This child might die of cancer caused by the poisoning of the air they breathe or the food they eat. This child might die in some senseless war or by another pandemic or as a refugee crisis triggered by ecological disaster. But there's another thing to see in this child's face. Allow your awareness to open to the very real possibility that this child will play a divisive role in the healing of the world and the building of community. That this child is in the right place at the right moment with the right gifts. Allow that possibility to enter your mind. And as you keep your eyes closed and try to focus on your breath, it goes in and it goes out. Try to feel what it would be to work alongside this child for the healing of the world and to prevent violence, warfare, economic crisis, and future pandemics. What would it feel like? And what would it feel like to have this child thank you for the work you're doing in your lifetime to ensure the world's continuance? Listen to the child for a few moments. And imagine that this child now lives in a world that is free of the imminent threat of economic crisis, that poverty has been eradicated, water is abundant, clean oceans are diverse and vital. Can you envision a healthy environment and a healed world in which artists and museums and curators play an active role in shaping? Allow this future child to rest in your heart as we come back into the room and open our eyes. So finally, to end this meditation, I'd like to bring some practical steps for healing the museum and creating what I'm calling the Museum of the Future. If an organisation wants to positively influence the social field around them, they must practice a lack of self-interest. And they will know this is happening when three things begin to occur spontaneously. One, the emergence of spontaneous positive states. Collectors and corporations giving money to institutions without expecting anything in return. No more corruption. Number two, the influence of mass behaviour. Listening empathically to the needs of colleagues, especially those with less power. No more toxic workplace. Number three, the accumulation of positive efforts that affect the unfolding of the long-term mission. For example, committing to change the ecological footprint of the art organisation, especially working with source and Indigenous communities from which the objects were taken from in the first place. These three things will allow institutions to change the course of history so that positive states eclipse self-interest and the institution starts to think of the greater good naturally. This is the Museum of the Future. And now I'll hand over to Stephanie.
Thank you, Grace, and thanks a lot to Experimenter to invite us, and to Grace, of course, to accept the invitation. And I think we're both very grateful to have the place and the time to talk more about I mean, for me, at least today, I really want to focus on the responsibility also of museums and institutions. And with Grace, having worked a lot with institutions and these questions of healing the museum, I felt it's a good space we're having here to come together and just continue to talk. And I feel that's what we want to do. And so I will be kind of very briefly, I think, giving a bit kind of, it's really like roots into my thinking and what I feel is important at the moment for us here at the Gropiusbau, for our curatorial program, but also what we just want to do in relation to the work with our audience. I want to just mention two things which I think are important for me, and I didn't bring images because we wanted to just limit the time we present individually. One of the very first exhibitions I've done in Munich was around artists and crafts. So this question of how important the hand is and how we're working, artists work with the hand. So this kind of relationship to the hand, but also to material and that kind of the bodily feeling you have when you touch, but also when you look at things. So that was a show I think was very important to me, which I think it was 2000, maybe 3 or 4. And the other thing I want to mention before I dive into a kind of few shows I want to talk about a bit more is that I wrote my PhD about, like kind of the in-between space, and the in-between space, which is very much kind of often represented in the color black, and what that in-between space actually, how much that is opening up. So I'm referring here to what Arnold von Gennep calls the rite de marche, the kind of space where you actually don't know where you're going next. Doing as a curator and also director is always looking for that space where I don't know, and I kind of go into a phase of search and trying to understand. And so if I think about what institutions or museums, exhibitions halls, so what is our responsibility right now, then I feel there are few artists who have led me during my own career. And so one of these artists, certainly in thinking of how can we step out of the institution and actually go beyond what probably institutions have been since they were built, is Alan Capro. So he is an artist I worked with very intensively for 3 years until we opened the show in 2006 together with the curator Eva Meyer-Hermann. And what Alan Capro, who's basically the inventor of the happening, really taught me was to go out of the institution and how you can make an exhibition by not having the exhibition in the museum. And he was very much, and I know that grace thinking is also coming from there. The first time I met him, he was saying, you know, for him, an institution is a cemetery. And he wants an institution to be an agent of action. And that's why he never had a show in a public institution. And so if you go to the next one, you see, I hope you, so yes, you see that Alan Capro has worked all his life with happenings all over the city by handing out scores, which you see on the next slide. And this one is fluids. And so what we did with him, we worked on questions, how can we work with the whole city? And we worked with all the cities we've done the show to basically do these happenings outside of the institution, in their homes, with friends, at universities, in theaters. And the exhibition, if you click further, was basically representing his scores and the activities outside of the institution, by also asking the visitors to really kind of basically participate in how the show unfolds. If you go to the next one. Yes, and if we even go to the next one, you see how, and the next one, you can just click through it, how we've kind of engaged and tried to engage other visitors online, off-site, on-site, and also in the city with these really large-scale happenings. And so that's what we try to do in the different cities. And I guess what I learned from the work with Capro is really what we're still trying to see, how can we actually really give a space to our audience to bring what we do inside the institution outside. Because for me, that is really a way of having these conversations and building a community of which also Grace talks, and kind of bringing these activities, making it more lively, and kind of trying as an institution to activate the activities. And of course, another side of that is the archive. And so these shows I've done have very often a large archive side, because I feel that the past, that of course we as institutions also have a responsibility to not forget the past, and to think about that and kind of carry the injuries and the pains which we had with us, without kind of, you know, feeling that the museum is dead and that there's no life in it. So I have these two parts. And I think with Alan Capro and his show, we really kind of, I learned, and my co-curators at the time learned that. And then in continuation, a big focus was really to do exhibitions with curatorial concepts where the body and how we experience with the body became very important, and also have choreographic pieces which really negotiate these kind of activities, which then went from, you know, practicing dance, but also discussing, you know, the conditions and the salaries and the situations of performers, to really use the institution as a place of negotiations, and also addressing difficulties. And then with Mingwei and artists also like Ottobong the Congo, Wu Tsang, we more and more thought about, we have to exercise hospitality. Like we have to learn to welcome people, and how do we do that, and who do we want to welcome? And so with programs like Rituals of Care, we kind of started to really also think about what do we have to do in the building to maybe change the energy, change the aura, and give people the opportunity to work with us to create open spaces or in between spaces. So I had such a interest to work with Grace to really talk more about what are the possibilities. And I think we both agreed that conversation is the first step for us to think beyond the exhibition we're doing together end of next year about care, repair, and healing. And I think for now, because I know I've been interrupted in my time, therefore passed maybe a bit quicker. If we have time at the end, I'm happy to talk a bit more about Li Mingwei and this idea of hospitality, and Ayumi Paul, who does the singing project and brings women from Berlin to the Gropius Bau to sing together, or One Wu Council by Cheng Bo. But I think for now, I kind of would like to start and hand over to Grace again, so that we'll have time for a conversation and kind of be in the now and talk about what's going on right now.
Thank you, Stephanie. So me and Stephanie, when we were discussing about how to do this event today, we thought, because I've spent a lot of time, I wrote a book called Descent Without Modification, where I interviewed radical women, so artists, hackers, activists. We thought it was quite good to kind of do it as a kind of a long form interview between the two of us. So both of us will be asking questions about our practices back and forth. But for now, we thought about the first question really is we should really situate what's just happened. So namely the pandemic. So I'd like to ask Stephanie first, how she kind of have experienced the last 18 months, how she experienced the lockdown, and how this affected her practice as director of a museum.
Yeah, I think, being here based in Berlin, in Germany, we had, as a large institution, we were very fortunate. So we got additional funding from the government. And of course, we were painfully aware of the fact that we were very privileged in that, and that we could honor our contracts and pay the fees. We could move shows and got compensated. So I think as an institution, this phase has also allowed us to a certain kind of growth, because we were able to really focus more on the digital, to kind of go deeper into research about the building and our own history. That's the one side. I think the other side is something which, we're slowly realizing, I think, that even if we've been so fortunate, of course, it was a big, it took a big toll, I think, on the team, and at the end, even if everything feels secure, it's still stressful, because you don't know what's really happening. Like, you don't know, do we open, do we don't open, how many scenarios we went through. And I feel not only, here with us, but in general, I feel many people are unwell now, and, go into depression and feel that actually this time we don't even, I don't think we can put a finger on it. What was it really? But I think it's that uncertainty, that kind of here in the West, completely new idea of isolation due to a pandemic, a virus. Things I think people have experienced in the other parts of the world much earlier is really new for us here. And I think a lot of things came up for people, also just being at home, being able to be confronted with your own life, with what you're doing, what's your work like. So I think it's a very deep time for many people to realize, to come out of this pandemic, but not really knowing if it is really coming out, or if it's actually just the end and the beginning of a new one. So there is, I think, from that perspective, I feel the institution as a whole has learned, and now I think we're still in this real process of understanding what has really happened and how do we want to move forward and what is our role. And I think so one aspect I feel I would like to learn from you, Grace, is really this question of how how can we reach out? So how can we work maybe with an audience which is not even coming to the museum, but to extend this idea of going somewhere, if that's part of your thinking too, or I guess it goes very much in this idea of maybe the museum of the future, or the healing of the museum.
Yeah, I mean, I'll first maybe tell a bit about my experience as an artist during the lockdown, because I think it's maybe a very different experience. In terms of as an individual artist, not working in a collective, let's say, or group scenario, like you would have at Groper's Bow, having a team and stuff. There was a sense of having to be much more resilient, and but also a sense of needing to reach out more to other artists. And so a feeling of solidarity did come. And for me, what was so interesting is because in my practice, I studied textile art originally, and then I studied at ateliers in Amsterdam, started making videos and performance and painting and, all sorts of mediums. But I also had a double life because I had a very strong esoteric practice for the last 20 years. Focused on shamanism, yoga, meditation, working with many different teachers, gurus. And for me, it was really fascinating that 20 years ago when I began that practice, and I would mention it in the art world, people were very suspicious or made fun of it. When I would say, oh, I'm going to my meditation class, they would be like, why are you doing that? And like how the world's changed so much in 20 years. Now it's kind of weird if you don't do meditation in the art world. And so what really happened for me during the lockdown was how the world focused so much, especially the art world, is that people, it kind of caught up, with this thing that I've been like fascinated with in the last few years, last 20 years, this feeling of how important contemplation is, how important introspection is. And so for me, the fact that that happened and that the world, and also because of the social unrest, with Black Lives Matter and other movements happening, it felt like finally people were willing to listen to what had been going on about. So in some ways, the lockdown and the pandemic actually was quite good for me in that sense of feeling like a much stronger sense of community and solidarity. But yes, economically, what was interesting was like, on one hand, I had a lot of invitations to do talks and things online, and in fact, I didn't actually get to have so much of a break during the lockdown. I was busy basically all the time. But then, other friends of mine, because of the nature of their practice meant that all their shows were delayed. I mean, my shows were delayed, but I could still work, like, for example, my first film, Black Beauty, that's in the Biennale, I could do the pre-production. I could also, even when it opened up a bit in last summer, in Europe, things opened up a bit. I was able to do the production and the post-production during this weird time. But also, so it really depended. But I remember one specific, this is a funny example. I was invited to go on this talk radio show called Times Radio. It's like for the Times newspaper in London. And it's kind of, I didn't know what I was getting into actually, but I thought I'm going to do it. It's got quite a famous journalist, Marissa Vrostrop, who does this radio show. So I thought, okay, it could be interesting. And so it was about economics and COVID. So they'd asked a gallerist from Cork Street, they'd asked a curator historian from the National Portrait Gallery, and me to be on this panel. And so obviously we had such different experience of COVID and experience of like the economic discrepancies and things. And one of the things that was really funny, and I realized how different and how many art worlds there are, there's not just one art world, there's many art worlds, is when the historian guy kept on going on about his biggest issue was that actually he had bought a Van Eyck or something at auction in Chicago, and he was trying to ship it back to London, and he couldn't do it because of the lockdown, because of FedEx, and that was his issue.
His issue, yeah.
That was his problem. And then my issue was trying to explain to him about like how lots of arts funding had been cut, and like, you know, artists were struggling because there were sort of COVID, you know, not in Germany, but in other countries. You know, every country was very different, but like the Arts Council had decided to give money specifically for a COVID fund, but that it meant that its normal funding had gone. So it kind of like was just moving money around, which kind of disrupted actually the flow of how artists were working. So it was very complicated, but that example of that conversation on that radio show shows the whole breadth of what people are experiencing in the art world. And then it really made me also think about, you know, what you were starting to talk about in terms of mental health, you know, and like how, you know, the pandemic affected you know, especially artists, like the feeling of like wanting to produce and being very creative, but not having this outlet and not having, and having this uncertainty and this instability around what to do with what they were producing, and having to come up with different ways and kind of new ways of, you know, showing or, you know, dealing with things. And so one of the things that I did is I made a second film during the lockdown called Becoming Plants, which was about psychedelics and healing. And so I conducted it, because in my practice, I should say, maybe we could show some images from my work.
Just to say, you'll have 5 more minutes. Thank you so much.
Natasha, 5 more minutes for the conversation before we do the conversation with you.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so this image online right now, this is for a project called the Goethe. It was a project sponsored by Goethe about healing the museum, where I basically take different types of people into museums to meditate and to work with objects. And so this idea of healing mental health as a political, in a political way, so using meditation or shamanism as a political tool, or a psychedelic as a political tool to come up with new answers to things. So yeah, like I was saying, I started making this film called Becoming Plant, where I invited 6 dancers to take psychedelics in front of the camera. And I also work with a psychiatrist who kind of narrates the film and talks about the different aspects of not only what the psychedelics do to the human mind in terms of the brain data and the right brain and the left brain, but also in terms of the politics of what's going on in the world at the moment. So how apparently, according to WHO in 2023, mental health is going to be the biggest pandemic in the world, actually. So that's something I think that's quite interesting when we start to think about things like the Museum of the Future, like in terms of institutions, how institutions can help artists and audiences deal with issues like that. And when they're coming into, you know, I mean, as a director, I'm interested in your, how you come about in terms of when you're thinking about transforming museums, like what challenges for you go beyond audience engagement?
I mean, just to say that I do think it's very important, and thanks for bringing it up, because even in Germany, you know, there was a huge inequality in relation to how institutions got supported and individual artists, and many of the artists, you know, ended up in big crises, and it's always the same. I think that, and so I feel beyond, I do think, you know, what we learned during the pandemic, and we want to think about further, and, you know, looking for solutions is what you're saying. It's also like, for whom can we be a space? Like, for example, during the pandemic, we thought about and tried to open up the schools, because it was difficult for schools to open because of the spatial restrictions. So, you know, we thought, what about opening and you know, instead of having an exhibition in our atrium, why can't we just have, 2 classes in the atrium? So this kind of being really deciding that, an institution in our times doesn't only have, it's not just about showing art. It can also be in these moments, just kind of acting differently. And I think also what we've started to do more is working, trying to embrace ideas of certain rituals, kind of seeing how we can bring that in and think beyond this classical idea of exhibition making.
Yeah, so I wonder, as a general question, why do you think there's so much need for change in institutions? Because what is so wrong with our institutions that we need so much change? And why is the change mostly at the moment being pressured and activated from outside groups and not from within? You know what I mean? Like if we hadn't had the social unrest and then people picketing, like for example in America and England, about wage discrepancies in museums and about board members and stuff, would the museum change? Because that's one of the things that I question within Healing the Museum. I always fundamentally believe that these public institutions belong to us, the people, and so we have a right, and it makes sense that we are in one point of evolution in a museum at the moment. At first it started in the Victorian age, there was that type of museum. Now we're in this type of museum, that the museum can evolve. And so I wonder, why is it that it takes so much pressure from outside for museums to change? Why is there not some sort of innate feeling to want to change?
I mean, I can't speak, of course, generally. I think there is also from inside a desire from people who work in institutions, but very often it's related to the funding structures and who really then is able to make the changes. But I also think my belief is that institutions, the purpose of an institution should actually be to represent change and transformation. I think the arts, I see us as, we as cultural institution have to show that we have to challenge bureaucratic and administrative processes, because I think we can easier than many other public entities. So I do feel, the one purpose of art is change and changing. And because I think that's what artists are demonstrating, that there's such a need from, I do think that the pressure from outside is hugely necessary, because it has to always, I think this kind of shaking up of things, it has to come from 2 sides. And of course, museums have a very conservative structure because it's the caring of artworks. And there, I think, it's much harder very often to understand that you could do that differently and that different structures could put in place. Places like the Gropius, who are actually exhibition halls, we, of course, for us, it's much easier. I can sit here and say, we let everybody in. Because, of course, I have the responsibility for the works we're showing in that moment, but not, for a whole kind of depot below us, which is precious things where, it's a completely different discussion. And I don't think that there's something specifically wrong with institutions right now, because if we think of Capro, who said already, late 50s institutions or cemeteries. So I think it's an ongoing, trying to catch up and kind of seeing, on the one hand, preserving, and on the other hand, bringing and being able and creating a platform. I do think that the 21st century, luckily, is a century where we have to and have to rethink a lot of structures and kind of realize that, we can, because the pressure is now big enough. And that's, I think, just new generations who are coming, who are realizing this is now possible. So I do think it's just a constant transformation, which needs, a kind of rolling over. But I don't feel it's only happening now. I feel like it just, or maybe what you're saying, it just took a very long time. And I do feel we're now in a time where luckily change is more likely.
Yes, I mean, for me, I think in 2012.
Sorry, Grace.
Oh, sorry.
Just to say that we're running out of time. So if we could actually open this up, since it's actually also wonderful to have a dialogue. We have over 100 people watching within the Zoom and also online and other forums where this is broadcasted. So we'd really love to open this up soon. I'd like to ask you, Grace, to perhaps elaborate on the way in which you have addressed, very importantly, the questions of environmental justice and intergenerational trauma as inseparable realms, because this is something extremely integral, right, to a kind of transformative shift in practice as well as in institution building. And so could you perhaps give us some examples? And this is really a propositional space. So it's not necessarily about the work you've already done, but what you seek to do perhaps ahead, given the circumstances we're living through, to braid together these realms of what you term stolen culture and stolen climate.
Yes, I mean, I can give you an example of a project that I did that worked quite successfully, and then a project that I'm in right now. So a project that I did, as you know, is called A Meal for My Ancestors, from the Healing Museum, where I worked with staff members from the UN, from NATO, and from the Parliament. And I also worked with refugees and migrants. And I kept these two groups separate for 4 months. And I gave them free meditation classes, free creative visualization classes. And then after 4 months, I brought them together to do a shamanic performance. And the performance was really focused on how we could heal trauma through food, art, and shamanism. And this was in the background of the terrorist attacks that had happened in Brussels and the beginning of the refugee crisis, the Syrian refugee crisis. So what happened during that performance was very powerful, because these two groups that never meet actually met. And they actually, you know, did the performance together. They lay on the ground, they went on the shamanic journey. And then we spent the whole weekend together in conference and with food, eating together. And it turned out that a lot of those people had seen the same sort of images on the shamanic journey. And those were images to do with climate change. And specifically, a woman who worked in the Foreign Office, she had seen a very strong vision to do with climate change refugees. And so she was inspired to start this think tank in the EU Parliament and to write a paper about it. Because in her vision, she had seen that, she'd understood that actually at the moment, if you're a refugee and you come to Europe and you try to claim asylum for climate reasons, you won't get it. But if you come for war or genocide, you will. And so she wanted to start this think tank to try and change this law. And to me, that really shows like the power of like, you know, working in a performative way, using these things I call non-rational methodologies, like shamanism, meditation, bringing them into museums, bringing in new audiences that never go to the museum, and how actually something practical and functional can come out of that, like a think tank or like a paper in trying to change a law. From currently, right now, I'm working on a project about land rights, also in Belgium. And this is a very complicated project because it involves a site which has, it's a church, so it has a history from medieval times. The first users were the monks. Then they were thrown out because of the French Revolution. Then part of it was the city bought it. Then part of it was sold to the province. So, and then a developer bought it. So there's all these user groups are basically at each other's, there's a dispute over ownership and over usage. And in the 60s, it was squatted by hippies who wanted to live there. Then they were thrown out by the government. And now there's a young generation of young artists in the last few months who have re-squatted. So I'm involved in this project about how we can work this out. So I've devised a program about, it's called A Season of Truth and Reconciliation, where we do film screenings, we do like some sort of, I call it therapeutic town hall meetings, where it's more of a performative element, where we do letter writing to the enemy. So you have to write love letters to your enemy. So let's say an artist activist will have to write a love letter to a property developer, you know, Also in the project, we have made a huge archive from the history of the building, and what's all leading up to this public debate. And the public debate is to contextualize this local issue in Belgium, but in the global sphere, because the issue of indigenous rights, indigenous land rights, is being repeated, you know, where land and sites are being taken by corporations or by government and sold off. And so it's really important when I think working on local issues to contextualize them globally, and not only from a Western frame point, but more from an indigenous frame point. And that's been a practice of mine for a long time. You know, I feel like indigenous traditional knowledge, as well as you could say contemporary Western knowledge, needs to be seen on an equal level and needs to be able to be interchanged. And so we can learn from each other. So I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
I have a question for Stephanie, which is, perhaps this is a moment where we could bring forth further around this notion of hospitality, both inside and beyond the institutional terrain. Because the way that you've been working is really around animating hospitality through process-oriented artistic approaches. Well, whether that is the happening or the notion of the gift in terms of Li Mengwei, but also expanded forms of choreography, especially right from move to rituals of care. So there's a long timeline in the work that you have done with the way that expanded forms of choreography also challenge our relationship to both temporality and singularity. And so I'm intrigued how you've been negotiating circumstances for these kind of ephemeral, exchange-based sort of fluid forces, you know, within where there is such emphasis in large-scale museums and Kunsthallen on the objecthood of art.
Yeah, I mean, it is, you know, very much learning or kind of experiencing by doing it together with artists. And I do feel that obviously I've been, well, not obviously, but I've been part of that long discussion, which is now probably nearly 15 years ago, where we started to say performance and performance art has to be more present in institutions. And I mean, that went from showing it to collecting it, to archiving it, to not owning it, but recognizing the importance of these art forms. But at the same time, also saying that the kind of time-related processes and institutions are really important to be present, to move away from the idea that we have to show static objects. And of course, that kind of brings with it many, many structural complications, you know, from very simple facts that if you do that, you need a dance floor and water in an institution which already challenges most structures. So it's very simple things which actually lead to, of course, huge discussions about being human and, you know, having to, of course, considering these things, which I think very often have not been considered by institutions, but also going beyond, I think, and doing that, I learned a lot about, you know, just the question of what does it mean just for a body to enter an institution and how can we work with that. And so we're starting at the Gropiusbau the very conscious decision to work with artists on really this question of how can we welcome and what are the rituals of welcoming, not only in Germany, but all over the world. So having someone like Li Mengwei, but also even Wu Zhang to just kind of think about what does that mean. And that goes beyond then a show or inviting one artist, but really a whole mindset of an institution. And so what interests me really especially is this question of how can institutions move from these, you know, kind of elitistic spaces for certain groups to places who are who are hosting, you know, and hosting on a very broad level, from like food events to, you know, social events. And that is, I think it's still a big challenge because you're mostly confronted with large structures who don't see that that's part of your responsibilities. So to explain that that's actually an essential part and it's not just an entertainment we enjoy for ourselves is something I think we have to work quite hard for, and I think it's very important.
Thank you. We do have an audience question, and I'll wait for another one to come along, so we can take them in one go. So the first one is from Nakosh, who suggests that really when talking about institutions, there has always been a crisis for humanity at the level of power and hegemony. So when thinking philosophically also in connection to academic environments where such discussions have remained ongoing for a long time, what are the engagements that you both have taken on in relation to also the kind of scholarly or academic environment? That's the audience question. And to that, I would also like to add how perhaps such a role of interdisciplinarity in relation to opening up and reimagining the institution, even in terms of its sort of constructive shifts that happen at the level of methodology and access, are also worked out through the kind of artists that have been especially coming to the Gropiusbau when we think about Zheng Bo and the Wanbu Council, for instance. And I wondered if that's perhaps also a way to think through this connection between art, science, activism, and the kind of knowledge systems that have been worked through and brought into such an institution in Berlin.
I mean, I can answer from the point of view for some of the projects that I've been doing. So I should say that after I studied in Amsterdam, I moved to London for 6 years, and then I quit everything and I went to live in the rural. So like in nature spaces and in a lot of like either hippie, permaculture, off-grid communities. And so I spent a lot of time having this urban-rural dynamic. And then after a few years of that, I decided to do this project called The Arc. So this was a project where instead of just actually having an exhibition of this kind of lived research, I decided to actually start my own community, where I invited artists, scientists, and spiritual people to live off-grid on the outskirts of Paris. And so this way of holistic learning and this kind of, I see as a radical pedagogical way of thinking, has really influenced my practice. So even if I'm working in academia, you know, doing a teaching day, I always normally kind of do some sort of holistic way of working with students, either through reading groups that involve text and meditation, or, you know, on a larger scale, things like I was sort of saying about the Goethe project, where we worked at the African Museum and other ethnographic museums with a team of scientists from Africa, academics, artists, and activists, so from the continent and also from Europe. And we would go to different museums, so in France, in Italy, and in Spain. And we would have closed group workshops where we would really kind of try to work out this issue of restitution. And this was because it felt actually very important to have all these different thinkers in the same place. And so everyone would contribute in different ways. But my contribution was that I did this performance called Healing the Museum, where I took people into the gem and mineral room of the African Museum. So the African Museum holds all these diamonds and minerals that were taken by Belgium from the Congo. So you can understand that this idea of these blood diamonds that look very beautiful, but they have like this very difficult history. And so we meditated in this room. And then so some of the Congolese activists and artists and scientists, they got upset because obviously it's their history and we were connecting with that energy. But what happened in the process is that it became a very cathartic experience for the whole group, for the whole 20 of us. And so afterwards, when we would have other sessions in the conference, which were much more about legal strategies, like how to send objects back to Africa, or different ways of thinking about, you know, protection for objects and, you know, very, let's say, much more mundane subjects, because we'd been through this kind of spiritual cathartic experience together. Even the museum directors, you know, had to go through this experience and sit on the floor, take your shoes off and like be with the objects for once. We bonded very strongly as a group, which meant that when we did, and when we went on to work in other museum settings, it meant that we'd really had this ability to see each other's perspective on a different level. So for me, it's really, yeah, I think because of my training in these esoteric practices that are part of my actual life, they're not just, I do it for art, you know, I do them for me. I think they're really important. I think the only thing is that museums have to be careful to think about this idea of spiritual materialism, that you don't want to enact this idea of spirituality as a form of entertainment, you know, and you have to be very careful when using these practices in museums.
Maybe from my side, from kind of, you know, how we try to bring what we're learning here together in the field of academia or activism is really through the artists and the collaborators we engage with. So, and I think One Wu Council, what was staged by Cheng Bo, is probably a good example of how inviting an artist who's really reflecting on how institutions, how he says, can become more Wan Wu, meaning, you know, going beyond and not being only concerned with the human, but also with the non-human, and how we can care or kind of acknowledge the life of plants and how the plants are essential for us. So him bringing all these different experts from kind of ethnology, microbiology, kind of activists who basically work in relation to sustainable building structures. So to them then together basically write a manifesto, and a manifesto which will end up in a publication. And, you know, for Cheng Bo, it's important that that manifesto is not just for the Gropius, but that can be really kind of be also a kind of guidance for other institutions. And I think that, you know, the kind of longer processes with our artists in residence to kind of connect with their research and expertise to carry it further. I think it's an important part which really goes beyond, you know, us as curators writing texts or producing catalogs or making podcasts or having an online journal. I think these things are really kind of more long term. But also, I mean, research for me is also a practical research, you know, how we actually work with the outside of the building, how we explore things and how they slowly establish and become, you know, a normality. So these kind of slow steps of actually, you know, field research with our visitors and then changing slowly the institutions, I think it's an important part to really kind of, yeah, have an impact which goes beyond just the kind of realms of the doors you walk in and pay a ticket for a show.
Thank you. That connects quite well to our next question, which is from another audience member, Uttara Rajgopal, who asks, do you think museums should incorporate more collaborative curating with the everyday public? Which is perhaps a question that has been asked before, but since the way you're also discussing these projects, it might be interesting to see what that even means, what that participation actually means and how inclusive it actually also is eventually.
I mean, I could answer that. I feel like, well, I've done a few projects in museums, most recently in the Museum of Anthropology in Vancouver. And they've been working for over 15 years, I think, with First Nation source communities. So bringing communities into the museum to work with objects, but also giving objects back to the communities to take back to their, you know, to where they live, so that they can, especially with these kind of objects, which were normally ritual objects, so that they can reactivate those objects, you know, again. And that's very important when working with ethnographic objects. And for me at the MOA, what was nice is that they invited me within the context of working with the African collections, but also the First Nation collections, because I'd done a project at the University of British Columbia called the Healing Justice. So it was a week-long performance project where I worked with First Nations, with artists, with local activists in Vancouver, students and other people. And yeah, for me, it was really important to be able to be in the collections, work in the collections, but also go out to sites like, for example, we did a traditional sweat lodge with a local First Nation group, but we also went to the oil pipelines. So where they are activating and also living there, trying to stop the building of the pipeline. So it's really important to have it as a lived project. I would say. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it could be an interesting example.
And I think for us at the group as well, I really do believe that it's important, you know, to have shows curated by people who wouldn't probably consider themselves experts. And so what I think we've done, and which was for me like a really beautiful and powerful experience, was that we've invited children to curate an exhibition, but not do this, you know, say, oh, this is our children exhibition, you know, and you clearly signpost it and say, this is actually kids having done it, but more saying, no, the kids get the same professional support than I would get. So they had an architect who worked with them, a graphic designer who worked with them, someone who also, you know, did their press release and helped them with the press release. So it was like a completely professional staged exhibition, which wasn't signposted as this is actually 11-year-old kids and this is actually, you know, Stephanie Rosenthal, the director, has curated. And it worked really well because they took on the task in the show, you know, and the way how they worked with artists was actually really professional, you know, so it wasn't this kind of naive approach of way. So I think we all learned a lot in the way how they would actually then give their opening speeches, which was just mesmerizing. And, you know, even I was glued to the screen because it was still online and listened to them because they had so many deep thoughts. And so I feel it's very important, you know, for us to see that as institutions, we really want to learn from, you know, I think it's a mistake to think we know, because and so that for us is like also with our neighborhood project, which is run by Diana Mamana, to just kind of really see what, you know, what comes also from how can we be a platform, and many projects we started since 2018 are really also to say we actually have a lot of space. So, you know, we want to also give it to people here in Berlin to say what is it they want to do and where they see an urgency. So and I feel we made some real good experiences with that, and that's a way to open up, you know, and really say this is like that's, for me, that's true collaborations.
Thank you. I'm going to bring together two questions, which are also from the audience. So this is for you, Grace. Your meditative interventions are held in contemporary institutions that are, of course, rapidly embracing wider knowledge systems. But what do you think of meditative processes that are all mostly rooted in indigenous practices located far away from the centers of these institutions, where although the intention may be in the right direction, but really holistically, do you think it would be more effective in non-institutional spaces that are themselves bound by other kinds of relationality than those hierarchical structures? And also there was another comment which was around, you know, what could you perhaps define more your relationship with shamanism? Because there is, on the one hand, again, a rooted practice, which is ancestral, that comes from certain kinds of indigenous domains, of also survival and resistance. And at the same time, there are artists, as we know with Joseph Beuys, using that term shamanism. And I think, especially in the time we are located in, it's extremely important to be quite self-conscious in those methodologies and the mode of inclusion.
Okay, so I should have said this, but we didn't have time. That my background, my family's from Kenya, so from rural Kenya. So I grew up there as well as in working class Birmingham. So when I was in Kenya as a child, I was had a very animistic upbringing, you know, in nature with trees and animals. And this carried on to have not only ancestral, you could say, ancestral knowledges come through, but also certain practices that I was practicing as a small child, like in my bedroom, even when I was in Birmingham. So when I was going to school. So this was one of the, I would say, backgrounds to that. And then as an adult, I formally went to study with different types of shamans. So I learned about core shamanism. So that means the foundational idea of the journey, which can be taken or put with certain cultural specificities. So like in Siberian shamanism with the mouth harp, in Latin American countries, a lot of times with plant medicine. But there are different types of, I've used the different types of tools that I've been learning from my teachers and from ancestors to come up with these performances. And so I should say, I had my spiritual coming out in 2012 in the art world because of what I said, this history of, you know, not being recognized and being welcomed to be able to talk about these things there. And so I only have ever done it when it's specifically aimed at addressing a political issue. So for example, I was in Texas on a residency there, and I lived in Galveston, which is an island that belongs to Texas, but it's in the Gulf of Mexico. And there's many different people that live on that island. So there's African Americans, there's Mexicans, there's whites, there's some Native Americans, but a very small population that all live together. And so there's hippies, there's people that work on at the medical university, there's tourists, there's people that work in oil there as well. And so I decided to do a performance outdoors, which is about connecting with plants and asking plants what they thought the function of art was in the 21st century. And so without taking plant medicine, but just doing it through trance drumming, we as a mixed group of people from different backgrounds went on this journey together to ask the plants what they thought and to come up with different answers. And to me, I felt that was really important. To sometimes it's nice to do it in collections and inside museums, but also to be able to do it outdoors, you know. But the key is actually not necessarily where you are physically. It's more that you need to be able to connect with energies that are maybe located in different times and different spaces. And if you know how to do that, you know, as a shaman or as a healer, then actually, even though I'm talking to you right now, I'm also still connected with myself 50,000 years ago. And this idea of self 5,000 years in the future. So in that sense, deep time is actually the thing that actually brings, I would say, and underlines all of my practice. So whether it's painting, performance, essays, or, you know, photography, this idea that there is a non-linear time is key to understanding it. So I don't know if that kind of helps.
Thank you so much, Grace. So just in terms of a last question before we wrap up, I think this is it's a very direct one, and it's for Stephanie. If there was one thing you could change about the structure of the institution you're working with, what would that one thing be?
I think, so now I'm taking this very seriously and think, what would make a big difference? I think it's probably the possibility that these structures would allow us to work more organically. I think I see a huge importance in our work that we actually are allowed to you know, not be able to plan everything until the end, and, you know, be able to let and allow things to grow. And the structures we're in are actually really, you know, trying to not allow that, because it's considered a risk, instead of saying that actually these processes, you know, that's what we're for. And I think that's embedded in everything, you know, the way how we do budgets, the way how we think of team structures, and also our possibility to get people on board, you know, appoint people, have just more flexibility in saying, you know, for this project you need this, and for another one you need it just differently, and not everything can be the same. But in these bureaucratic structures, all that is considered as a risk. So it's tried to make to be impossible to work like that. And I do think that big institutions would benefit a lot from possibilities of really letting things grow. And so I would definitely think that would be a key to make you know, institutions more relevant also for our communities.
Thank you for that reflection. So we are rounding to a close for today. And I feel like within the session, starting also with Grace inviting us to imagine from a sort of a very personal place, a future generation link to precisely what are we leaving behind, what are we taking forward in terms of our values and methods, to thinking also quite pragmatically in terms of what is possible within institutions, and at the same time through the kind of invitations that an institution opens up. We've seen just over the last few years what actually organically develops within an institutional domain as well, where in fact audience groups are constantly changing. And that's been, I think, a great way to assess the journey in the case of the Gropius Bow. So thank you very much, Stephanie Rosenthal and Grace Ndiritu, for being with us today, especially after quite an intensive 4-day program series that took place physically at the Gropius Bow, multiple timed events. And so this reflection comes also at a very opportune moment. We thank you for the audience for joining us, and hope that you will be with us again tomorrow to welcome Michaela Tai and Mark Gonfine, who are joining us live for the continuation of the Experimenter Curators Hub.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. It was a huge story. Thanks a lot, Grace.
Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
Thanks for
Bye.
joining. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye, everybody.